The tow truck backed through the gate at Larkin Salvage and Tow at 9:11 in the morning, dragging behind it a flatbed rig that had not turned its own engine over in 11 years. 3 lawyers stood at the edge of the lot in coats too clean for the gravel. A tow crew of 4 waited with cutting torches already loaded in the truck bed. Somewhere on a phone line stretching back to a glass office 40 minutes away, a company assistant confirmed, for the second time that morning, that the vehicle was to be shredded within the hour, invoice number attached, no further inspection required. Why would a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars send 3 lawyers and a tow crew after one dead truck instead of just letting it rust behind a fence somewhere until it forgot itself? Nobody at the yard asked that question out loud. A gray-jacketed mechanic named Vincent Marsh did, though not that one. He came around the office trailer wiping his hands on a rag that had gone the color of the rag before it, looked at the truck the way a man looks at a face he half remembers from a long time ago, and said quietly that he'd like to look it over before anyone cut into it. The dispatcher, a heavy-set man named Gary who had run the front desk at Larkin's for 6 years and had never once in that time seen a mechanic ask permission to touch scrap, almost laughed. Not unkindly. It was the laugh of a man confronted with a joke so small it barely qualified. "It's going in the crusher in 50 minutes, Vince," he said. "Company already signed off. You want to look at it fast." He waved a hand toward the truck the way you'd wave someone toward a puddle, and went back to his clipboard, already forgetting the exchange had happened. Stay with this one. The truck isn't the thing being judged worthless here. Vincent stood at the edge of the flatbed for a long moment before he moved. The truck's paint had faded from a company blue to the color of an overcast sky, its side panel still legible enough to read Winthrop Aerostructures, test division beneath 11 years of yard dust. A brass gauge, dulled nearly black, sat crooked on the dashboard behind a cracked windshield. He did not touch anything yet. He only looked, the way another man might look at an old photograph before deciding whether he was ready to pick it up, and somewhere behind his eyes, something moved that had not moved in a long time. Not hope, not yet, nothing so unguarded as that. Just attention. The particular, total stillness of a man deciding whether a thing he had once loved was still, underneath all that dust, exactly what he remembered it being. 3 lawyers checked their watches. A tow crew leaned on their torches, and a scrapyard mechanic in a jacket with a frayed left cuff reached out and rested 2 fingers, lightly, on the truck's cold brass gauge, the way you'd check a pulse you weren't sure you'd find. 6:15 came the same way it had for 3 years now. 2 knocks on Opal's door, never 3, and the small voice on the other side already awake, already dressed, waiting to be found rather than woken. Vincent kept oatmeal on a low flame while she picked her socks off the floor, one blue and one striped, because she liked them that way, and had stopped explaining why sometime around her 7th birthday. She came into the kitchen already reaching for his sleeve, 2 fingers working the frayed cuff of his work jacket straight the way she did every morning, an inspection she never announced and he never thanked her for, because some things were only real if nobody talked about them. "You're going to be late," she told him, not a question, just an observation delivered the way she delivered most of her observations, flat and certain and usually correct. He drove her the 2 blocks to school before driving himself the 11 miles to the yard, and somewhere in that 11-mile stretch, more mornings than he could count, his mind went back to a building he no longer worked in. 9 years he'd spent at Winthrop Aerostructures, most of them at a hydraulics bench 3 doors down from a structural engineer named Diane, who had married him in year 3 and argued with him about torque specifications in year 4, and told him, more than once, standing in a lab that smelled of solvent and cut aluminum, that a machine only ever lied because somebody told it to. He had built the calibration protocol that certified every W-Series test truck the company ever fielded, built it by hand, by feel, by 9 years of listening to hydraulic lines the way other engineers listened to readouts. His name had been on the patent filing once. Then a merger came through in his 9th year, restructuring language stacked 11 pages deep, and somewhere in that stack his name quietly stopped appearing on anything that mattered. The same year, in a different kind of restructuring no lawyer could file paperwork against, Diane was diagnosed. He left the company without much of a fight left in him to give it, because there wasn't room left over for 2 losses at once, and some fights you let go of so you can hold on to the one that actually matters. Catherine Winthrop's car pulled into the yard at 9:40, 11 minutes before the truck was scheduled to disappear, trailed by a company photographer who'd been told to get one clean shot of the audit closure for the quarterly report. She was 44, precise in the way people are precise when precision has been mistaken for competence their whole lives, and she had inherited Winthrop Aerostructures 18 months earlier from a father whose name was still on the building. Beside her walked Preston Aldington, 34, the company's lead diagnostics engineer, a man whose credentials filled half a page and whose patience for scrapyards filled considerably less. Vincent approached them both with the same unhurried economy of motion he brought to everything and asked again if he might have some time with the truck before it went to the crusher. Catherine looked at him the way she looked at most unscheduled requests, as an obstacle to a clean morning. "Let's be efficient about this," she said, the phrase arriving the way it always did with her, smooth and final, a sentence built to end conversations rather than start them. "That truck has been dead for over a decade. It failed every internal audit we ran on it before decommissioning. There's nothing here to look at." Preston didn't even bother with a full sentence. "It's not software compatible with anything we run now," he said, glancing at his phone. "Whatever you think you'd find, you won't have the tools to read it." A couple of the tow crew laughed under their breath, not cruelly, just the way men laugh at something that confirms what they already believed about the world. Vincent didn't argue the point. He didn't raise his voice, didn't list qualifications he no longer had a business card to prove, didn't do anything except ask a question instead of making a case. "If it's already dead," he said, "what's the harm in 10 minutes? Catherine considered it exactly as long as it took her assistant to check the schedule and confirm the crusher slot could shift without cost. And then, half as a joke pitched toward the crew rather than toward him, she said, "Fine, 10 minutes and not one more," because she had a photographer waiting and a board update to write. Preston folded his arms and stepped back to watch, already composing in his head the version of this he'd tell people later, the one where the scrapyard mechanic in the worn jacket spent 10 minutes proving exactly why he worked in a scrapyard. Vincent didn't hurry. He climbed onto the flatbed and crouched beside the truck's hydraulic manifold, running 2 fingers along a pressure line the way another man might check a fevered child's forehead, feeling for heat and give rather than reading a gauge. Preston watched with his arms still crossed, offering, once, that the line pressures wouldn't mean anything without the truck's original certification software, which no one at the company had licensed in 6 years. Vincent didn't answer that. He worked his way down the manifold in silence, pausing at a brass fitting near the dash, hand-machined, slightly asymmetric, unlike anything on the rest of the truck's stamped factory-standard hardware. He tilted his head very slightly, the way he did when something under the noise had caught his attention, and studied it a long moment before speaking. "This gauge isn't factory," he said, mostly to himself, though Curtis Ferris, the yard's veteran foreman, had wandered close enough to hear it. Curtis was 61, had run this shop floor for decades, and was the only person at Larkin's who'd known, since the day Vincent was hired 4 years back, that the quiet new mechanic had once built things far more complicated than what came through the gate now. He didn't say that here. He only asked what Vincent needed. "There's a data logger sealed behind this panel," Vincent said. "Before anybody wipes this truck for scrap processing, I need that pulled and kept intact. Not reset, not overwritten, just pulled." Curtis didn't ask why. He'd learned a long time ago that when Vincent Marsh asked for something in that particular flat, unhurried tone, there was usually a reason worth more than the 10 minutes it cost to honor it, and he went to get the tools without another word, while Catherine checked her watch, and Preston Aldington, for the first time that morning, stopped composing his version of the story and started actually watching. The 10 minutes became 40 without anyone officially extending them, because nobody with the authority to stop him quite managed to say the word. Vincent worked the manifold by hand, purging a decade of settled air out of lines that had no business holding pressure at all, adjusting a sequence of valves in an order that matched nothing in Preston's memory and nothing in any manual currently licensed to the company. Preston pulled up a schematic on his phone twice, found it useless twice, and put the phone away. Catherine's photographer had stopped photographing the truck for the report and started, without instruction, photographing the crowd that had begun to gather instead, 3 tow crew, 2 lawyers who'd lost interest in their watches, Curtis standing with his arms folded like a man watching something he already believed in. At 41 minutes, Vincent reached the cab, pressed a sequence into a panel of toggles that hadn't been touched since before Opal was born, and the W-12's hydraulic test rig hissed once, shuddered, and came alive. Not loudly, not dramatically. A steady, even cycling of pressure through lines that had been declared dead 11 years earlier, the brass gauge on the dash swinging up off its rest pin and settling, clean and exact, at a reading that matched a specification no one present had memorized except the man who'd written it. Nobody clapped. Nobody spoke for a moment that stretched longer than any of them expected it to. Preston broke the silence by doing the only thing his training had ever taught him to do when he didn't understand something. He went looking for documentation. He pulled the truck's asset file on his phone, found the original patent record buried 3 folders deep in a database nobody outside compliance ever opened, and there, in a footnote appended to a filing 11 years old, was a name that had been quietly omitted from every summary page since the merger, but never fully scrubbed from the source document itself. V. Marsh, lead design engineer, hydraulic test protocol, W series. Preston looked up from the phone, first at the truck, then at the gray-jacketed man crouched beside it with oil on his hands and no particular expression on his face, and said the only thing he could think to say, which came out smaller than he meant it to. "You built this." It wasn't a question, and Vincent didn't treat it like one. "I designed the protocol," he said. "The truck just remembers it." Catherine Winthrop stood very still at the edge of the flatbed, watching a gauge she had ordered destroyed an hour earlier settle into a reading that made perfect, undeniable sense, and understood, in the particular silence that follows a mistake finally recognized as one, exactly how close she had come to shredding the only man who could still read the truth this company had built, and then forgotten how to hear. The data logger, once Curtis pried its housing free without triggering the wipe cycle Preston hadn't even known existed, held 10 years of recorded test cycles. Pressures, tolerances, pass and fail thresholds logged automatically every time the truck certified a batch of landing gear hydraulics before shipment. Vincent transferred the readings to a laptop borrowed from Preston's own bag, and it took less than an hour for the first discrepancy to surface. A batch certified in the logger at a lower tolerance threshold than the same batch's official compliance filing recorded to the FAA. Not a small rounding difference. A pattern, repeating across years, always in the same direction, always making the part look safer on paper than the truck's own record said it had tested. Catherine read the numbers over Vincent's shoulder twice before she said anything, and when she did, her voice had lost the crispness it carried at 9:40 that morning. "That's not a truck problem," she said. "Show me the audit schedule." And when her assistant confirmed what she already suspected, a Federal Aviation Parts Compliance audit already on the calendar, 11 days out, something in her expression shifted from irritation into something closer to fear, though she was too controlled to let it show for long. An audit that found this discrepancy on its own, rather than one Winthrop Aerostructures reported first, would not simply cost money. It would cost the company its certification, and with it, the contract that kept half the building's lights on. Marion Kingsley, the company's chief operations officer, arrived at the yard 40 minutes later, called in by an assistant who assumed he'd want to see the reversal for himself. He was 52, hired under Catherine's father a decade earlier, and he did not look at the truck the way everyone else in the yard had that morning. He looked at the data logger, still connected to Preston's laptop, the way a man looks at a door he had specifically ordered locked. He said, mildly, that the truck's hydraulic system had likely degraded unpredictably after 11 years of neglect, that any readings it produced now should be treated as unreliable at best, dangerous at worst, and that company liability required the vehicle be reclassified immediately as an unsafe scrap hazard and shredded before close of business. No further handling, no further testing, effective immediately on his authority as operations chief. Catherine, distracted by the audit calendar and the shape of the discrepancy still glowing on the laptop screen, didn't argue. She simply nodded, already halfway back to her car, and told him to handle it. Vincent said nothing while Marion gave the order. He only watched him the way he'd watched the truck that morning, quietly and for longer than was comfortable, and then asked Curtis in the same flat voice he'd used to request the logger in the first place whether Larkins had a way to hold a vehicle overnight without a company's authorization, overriding the yard's own release paperwork. Curtis said that, as it happened, they did. The second tow request came in at 11 that night, routed through an after-hours dispatch line and carrying Marion Kingsley's digital signature authorizing immediate removal. No yard personnel present required, gate code attached. Curtis Ferris was still there when the truck pulled up, not because he'd expected it exactly, but because 30 years running a lot had taught him that anything moved this quietly, this late, was usually being moved away from somebody rather than toward something. He stood in front of the gate in his own coat, told the driver the release paperwork on file didn't match the vehicle's current hold status, and called Catherine directly rather than the dispatch line at 11:06 at night, waking her from whatever she'd managed to fall into after the day she'd had. She told the driver to stand down before she'd finished pulling on her shoes. By morning, Vincent had finished decoding the logger's full 10 years of entries, cross-referenced against the compliance filings Preston pulled from the company archive, and what surfaced wasn't simply a pattern of substituted parts, cheaper alloy landing gear components swapped in against the original specification, the difference quietly absorbed as cost savings and never disclosed. Buried in the earliest entries, the ones dated a full year before Catherine Winthrop had ever set foot in the company as anything but a teenager visiting her father's office, was a signed compliance waiver authorizing the very first substitution. The signature on it belonged to Catherine's father. Vincent ran the handwriting against 3 verified samples from the archive without saying a word about why, and Preston, watching him do it, understood before Vincent said anything at all. "It's not his signature," Vincent said finally, quiet as ever, sliding the comparison across the desk. "The pressure's wrong on every downstroke. Somebody traced it." Catherine picked up the page, and for a long moment she didn't speak, because there's a particular kind of stillness that comes over a person discovering that a decade of what they believed was their father's failure had actually been somebody else's forgery. That the man whose name was on the building had, in the one place it mattered most, been telling the truth all along, and someone else had spent 10 years making sure nobody could tell the difference. Catherine called the reckoning for the following morning, in a boardroom with a view of the same lot where the tow truck had once idled with its torches loaded, and she did not soften anything for the audience gathered there. Marion Kingsley sat at the far end of the table with his hands folded, and when the evidence was laid out plainly in front of him, the logger entries, the forged waiver, the decade of filings that didn't match a truck he'd tried twice to have destroyed before anyone could read it. He didn't deny it so much as stop speaking altogether, which in that room amounted to the same thing. He was walked out by building security within the hour, quietly, without a scene. The way a company handles a problem, it would rather not turn into a headline. Nobody in that room felt like celebrating. Preston Aldington, watching the man he'd once deferred to on every technical question, be escorted past the same engineering floor where Vincent had brought a dead truck back to life, said only, to no one in particular, that he'd been trained to trust the paperwork over the part. Nobody corrected him. Nobody needed to. Catherine turned to Vincent once the room had mostly emptied, and for the first time since the yard, she did not lead with efficiency. "I owe you an apology that's going to sound thin no matter how I say it," she told him, "so I'll just say the true version. I looked at you in that lot and saw a man in a worn jacket asking for 10 minutes, and I decided before you'd finished the sentence that you weren't worth them. I was wrong about the truck. I was wrong about you, and I don't know how a company says sorry for erasing a person's name from something he built, but I'd like to try." She offered him his old position back, restored title, back pay calculated generously, a public statement crediting him by name in every filing where his name had been quietly removed. Vincent listened to all of it without interrupting, the way he listened to a pressure line before deciding whether it needed adjusting, and when she finished, he answered with a single question rather than an argument. "What would it cost the company to fix the record instead of fixing my paycheck?" Catherine didn't have an answer prepared for that, which seemed to be exactly the point. Vincent told her, plainly, what he wanted in place of the salary and the title, an honest correction of every compliance filing the logger disputed, submitted to the FAA before the audit rather than during it. a mandatory retraining program for the engineering floor built around reading a machine's actual behavior rather than trusting a screen summary of it, and his name restored to the original patent record, not as a headline, just as a fact, because a fact was all it had ever needed to be. He didn't ask for his old office. He didn't ask for anyone's gratitude. Somewhere in the quiet that followed, he found himself thinking of Diane, standing in a lab that no longer existed under that name, telling him once, without any particular weight in her voice, that a machine only ever lied because a person had told it to. And understanding, sitting in this boardroom 11 years and one lifetime later, that she'd been talking about more than hydraulics even then. Catherine agreed to all three conditions before the meeting ended and made the fourth phone call of her career that she would later describe as the hardest, not to a board member, not to a shareholder, but to the FAA compliance office 3 days ahead of the scheduled audit to voluntarily disclose a decade of discrepancies before anyone else could find them for her. 6 months later, the W-12 stood in the lobby of Winthrop Aerostructures, fully restored, its brass gauge polished back to something close to its original shine, a small plaque beside it explaining, in plain language, what it had once tested and what it had nearly been destroyed to hide. Employees walking in each morning passed it the way people pass a piece of family history they've only recently been told the truth about, with a kind of quiet respect that hadn't been there when it was just an old truck taking up space. Preston Aldington, who now ran engineering onboarding for the company, brought every new hire to stand in front of it during their first week, and told them, briefly and without embellishment, the story of a mechanic in a worn jacket who'd asked for 10 minutes. Vincent worked at the company 2 days a week now, on terms he'd set himself, training junior engineers at a rebuilt hydraulics bench in a corner of the floor that still smelled faintly of solvent and cut metal, the same smell that had followed him home on his sleeves for 9 years before it stopped. The rest of his week stayed at Larkin's because Curtis had asked him to stay and because some loyalties don't get traded up just because a better offer arrives. Opal, now well into 3rd grade, had visited the reopened bench exactly once on a school half-day and had spent the better part of an hour drawing the brass gauge from memory in crayon while her father calibrated a training rig for the next morning's class, glancing over now and then not to correct her, but simply to watch her work the way she watched him work, both of them quiet in the particular way people are quiet when they have already said everything that needs saying. She'd taped the drawing inside the door of his new toolbox before he noticed she'd finished it, right where his hand would land every morning before he opened it to start the day, and neither of them had said a word about it since, because some things are only real if nobody talks about them. If you believe quiet competence deserves a second look before it's thrown away, you already understand why this one stayed with us.